Hello, and welcome to another episode of Yummy Data Science. In this episode, we are going to pick up from where we left off last time, which was that we were creating tidy data from our Medicare fee-for-service inpatient claims data. And a very quick recap, our inpatient claims data file has up to about 26 different columns for diagnosis codes. And tidy data, the principles of tidy data dictate that each variable should be in its own column. So the variable diagnosis code was in 26 different columns. So what we did is we flipped the data going from wide to long. And you'll see the code shortly, but this is what we did. And then we ended up with this tidy version that had the BENE-ID, year, ICD diagnosis code. In this episode, we are going to be creating a data model. And if you don't know what a data model is, I'll explain it very briefly. It's simply a blueprint or a map for organizing your data. And in our case, this is going to be a physical blueprint. So we've got this concept that we'll have two tables and they'll have a joined relationship, but we're also going to create physical copies of this table. In your own implementation, a data model may be a logical construct. So to you as an analyst, when you log into your database and you hook up to the right schema, you see your data model the way that IT intended it to be, but there's no physical copy. And that's fine too. So we already have the diagnosis file and we have BENE-ID year and diagnosis diag code. In our R script, we are going to be adding it to this file and we'll be creating the inpatient encounters file that will have as primary keys BENE-ID and claim. And it will have the DRG, the diagnosis related group. Recall that this is a way of categorizing like inpatient stays by grouping them together by their diagnostic and the resource utilization characteristics. This table will also have a principal diagnosis code. It will have a flag for ER, whether it was an ER visit or not, and it will have length of stay and the amount charged. Note that things like LOS and amount are the metrics of this table. And then many of these other things are the dimensions of the table. And one other thing that this is the joined relationship. This diagram was created in a free software called Draw.io. And it has several things in it, templates. So I used one of the templates to create this. But the relationship here means that one record in the diagnosis file joins to 0, 1, or more. And that makes sense because given a beneficiary and a year, we might have an inpatient encounter for him in our file, or we might not. We might have 0 records. We might have multiple records as well. So that's what the plus sign means. 0 plus means that it can join to 0, 1, or many. So now let's go over to our R code. You have seen lines 1 through 21 many times in the prior videos, basically reading in the inpatient claims file, doing some reformatting of the columns, reading them in their correct formats, creating new columns such as LOS, formatting DRG, and then removing a lot of the columns. Remember that we went from 200 columns to 120 columns. And then line 20, where you filter on the claim line number equal to 1. Remember that goes from almost 500. It goes from 58,000 to 20,000. So that's what this, and we decided we need the claim detail. And in our diagnosis, this code that starts on line 23 and ends at line 33, we are creating the diagnosis file, which is going from wide to long, and it is making the diagnosis columns principal diagnosis code, and anything that starts with ICD diagnosis code, those columns, we are pivoting them longer, and there are about 26 columns here. And so there are going to be two pieces of information when we pivot it longer. There's going to be the value of the column itself, and this column going to be the name of the column. So the name of the column goes in these fields, and the name of the column goes in ICD diag call, and the value goes in ICD diag CD. And then we said, well, if the ICD diag code is not blank, because we don't want to have blank rows in this data set. And then I also said here in line 32 that we want it to be, in line 32, we are actually removing the ICD diag call because we don't need the names. We don't care about the names. We only care about the values, and we only care about the distinct values. So now we've got the diagnosis table, and the diagnosis table has blown up because it went from a wide format to a long format, and that is 176,000 rows. So if I open this up, you'll see this is by Benny ID, year, and the diagnosis code, but it still doesn't mean much because you don't know what these are. So the next thing which we'll do is that we are going to look up what the diagnosis is. So the ICD-10 diagnosis can be found on many websites, including CDC, CMS, and they're given by year. So I took the 2024 lookups, and I put that CSV file on my computer, and I read that in. This is the lookup file. This is about 73,000. So it's the diagnosis code and the description. But the problem with the file that I have, diagnosis file, is that these go from 2015 to 2023. So there were some diagnosis codes that could not be found in the lookup. So what I did as a shortcut, and this is not what I would recommend, is I took out the codes that were not in the lookup. Then I compiled a list of them in CSV. I fed that list to perplexity.ai and asked it to fill in the descriptions. And in my prompt, I said, make sure you take it from the CMS website. And then after I got that, I checked a few of the values and made sure they were correct. So this is a shortcut. I do not recommend it. But the ideal way should have been that I should have downloaded the ICD-10 codes by year, put them in a nice database, created a comprehensive lookup, and then done it that way. But, I've sort of taken a few shortcuts. So in any case, that's what all the code that is in Commons is doing. And finally, I have my diagnosis file with the description. Now this tells me that this is sprain of ligaments. Then on the basis of the diagnosis file, I created a NUM diagnosis data set that simply tells me by beneficiary, by year, how many distinct number of diagnoses does this person have. And I did some testing here to make sure that what I was doing was correct. One person had 58 diagnoses, so I went back and looked at their records and made sure that there was no mistake in my coding. So now I'm creating the inpatient encounters or the inpatient main data set, and I have got NUM diagnosis. I'm left joining NUM diagnosis. I'm left joining the ICD diag lookup. And remember also that I have a DRG file that I'd like to look it up to. Generally, these lookup files are not part of your table, but so you'll have to do this too. Sometimes, if you get lucky, your IT team has already figured the lookups and put the descriptions there. Otherwise, looking up health codes and what they mean is quite a major undertaking on its own. So here we go. Now we have a file called diagnosis and we have a file called inpatient main, and this is going to be our data model. So let me quickly show you what diagnosis looks like. It has the BENE ID, year, the code, and the descriptor. And then here is the inpatient file, which has the BENE ID, claim ID, and it has relevant information about that stay. So how does this data model, this tiny data model, help us? Well, think about if you were doing an analysis of a cohort and somebody came to you and they said, well, we are wondering when we have 5 treatments for diabetes, 5 drugs for diabetes, and we want to know about patients who have diabetes and who have taken any one of these drugs, and we want to study them. So that's what's called a cohort analysis. So you might say, okay, and you might ask the person who has this question, you might ask them, well, what's your anchor date? So they might say, okay, we want these patients to be diagnosed with diabetes in 2022. So what you could do with this file is you could say, everybody by year in 2022 who had a diagnosis of diabetes. And you could layer on another complexity. You could say, okay, these are new diagnoses. So you could go back in the previous years and make sure those beneficiaries did not have a diagnosis of diabetes. So in any case, now what this file has become is become a driver file. It can be used to select the number of patients or to select the patients who are going to go in your study. So let's say, for example, you've selected 10,000 patients. Now you go to their utilization file, so the inpatient encounters file, and you would be able to look at what happened to them prior to the anchor date of 2022 and after that. And that's how studies are created and set up. And so then we can say, okay, all things equal, this is our cohort, this is the characteristics they have, this is their patient journey up to the diagnosis and up to the anchor date, and then this is their journey after the anchor date. And this whole framework helps you think about treatments and evaluate treatments and see what is effective and what is not. Well, this concludes our video on the data model. I hope this has helped. Thank you for listening.